He was an engineer who spent his life listening to machines and bodies the way other people listen to music. He fixed pumps and judged the pitch of metal with his hands. He wired hospitals with life-saving catheters and designed instruments that read the faintest signatures of the human heart. And then, while sitting quietly in a chair, trying to map the anatomy of attention, he measured a rhythm that seemed to link a single human being to the planet itself. That measurement, a steady, low pulse around 7 cycles per second, would, in his view, become a hinge between physiology and a capacity of perception most of us barely recognize exists. The discovery would be written up, argued over, and then the scientist would die in a high-profile plane crash while carrying notes that some later readers insisted were important. The sequence, discovery, disappearance, declassified programs adopting similar methods, reads like the plot of a techno-thriller. But the documents and instruments behind it are real enough to force a question. Could the bandwidth of our nervous system shape what we call reality? This scientist, an experimental engineer named Itzhak Bentov, sometimes spelled Bentov in older transcriptions, framed the puzzle in mechanical language. He treated the body as an instrument with resonant parts, a heart that produces waves of pressure, a spine that transmits those waves, a skull that can sympathetically vibrate. He approached meditation like an engineer approaches noise reduction, not as a spiritual surrender, but as a controlled tuning of mechanical and electrical signals. In his accounts, he described an unexpected alignment. Under certain breathing and posture conditions, the heart and brain fell into a synchronized rhythm near 7 Hertz. At the same time, sensitive field sensors recorded a measurable change, a widening electromagnetic signature around the body. For Bentov, this was not just curiosity. It suggested a plausible mechanism for experiences people report across cultures when they describe expanded awareness, greater empathy, or astonishing intuitive hits. In short, change the body's bandwidth and you change the picture the brain constructs of the world. To understand why that claim is both provocative and fragile, imagine your perception as a radio receiver. The receiver can be made more or less selective, tuned sharply to a single station or left wide open to a noisy band of signals. Our sensory organs and nervous system act like the radio circuit. They define which frequencies we pick up and which we ignore. Bentov suggested that evolution and personal training can expand or narrow that circuit's bandwidth. Most of us operate in a middle band, enough to navigate daily life, not enough to perceive the fuller sweep of electromagnetic and informational background. Believers call the field, skeptics call noise, and engineers call unmodeled signals. No, but in the laboratory, and later in anecdotal practice, he observed states where the filter seemed to widen. People reported time slowing, emotional information bleeding across interpersonal space, and what some described as intuitive access to distant events. Those are the kinds of claims that make scientists uncomfortable. They sit at the boundary between measurable correlations and interpretive leaps. Bentov knew that. He wrote like an engineer who was trying to be faithful to the instruments. What makes this narrative especially combustible is the historical trail that follows those measurements. Bentov published and spoke widely. His best-known popular book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, blends engineering description with speculative metaphysics in a tone that invites both readers and critics. Then, in 1979, he died in a plane crash that attracted publicity because he was carrying many pages of notes. The official investigation pointed to mechanical failure and weather factors, but some of his supporters and later investigators noticed a cluster of coincidences, unpublished diagrams, references to nervous system entrainment techniques, and the later appearance in declassified form of institutional interest in related practices. The Central Intelligence Agency's declassified 1983 Gateway Process Memo and the broader Project Stargate files that would later be released describe procedures aimed at hemispheric synchronization, altered states, and remote perception. Those documents do not cite Bentov directly as the source of the techniques, but they echo similar language: synchronization, resonance, induced coherence between bodily systems and neural patterns. When an independent-minded engineer reports a measurable 7 Hz resonance, and a few years later, classified memos outline protocols that exploit similar harmonics to induce non-local perception, patterns emerge that deserve examination. They do not by themselves prove that the crash was anything other than tragedy. They do, however, raise a hypothesis worth testing, that an engineer's lab measurements fed, explicitly or implicitly, into institutional programs that sought to harness altered attention. Before we follow that trail too far, it helps to anchor the technical claims in plain language. Bentov's core idea was deceptively simple. The nervous system acts as a bandwidth filter. Our sensory organs and neural circuits extract information and discard the rest. The richness of what we can experience depends not only on external stimuli, but on how our bodies and brains resonate with those stimuli. Certain rhythms, breathing patterns, heart oscillations, and brainwave synchronization across hemispheres can change the effective filter, allowing different modes of perception to emerge. Bentov suggested that one measurable frequency, about 7 Hz, close to the fundamental of the Schumann resonances of the Earth's electromagnetic cavity, corresponds to a state where heart and brain coherence support a wider field of awareness. Pause on that comparison for a moment. The Schumann resonance is a real, measurable phenomenon. It refers to a set of low-frequency peaks in the electromagnetic background of the Earth generated by lightning and trapped between the surface and the ionosphere. The basic Schumann frequency sits around 7.83 Hz. Scientists use that number in atmospheric studies. It is not mystical on its face. Bentov and a handful of experimenters noticed that physiological signals, especially under deep, slow breathing and certain postural conditions, could exhibit spectral energy near that region. Instruments like ballistocardiographs, which detect the mechanical motion of the body produced by cardiac ejection, and EEGs, which record electrical activity of the brain, can both show coherent oscillations when an individual is in a highly synchronized state. Bentov described the heart generating a regular pressure wave that travels up the spine, the mechanical pulse inducing skull micro-movements, and the brain's hemispheres falling into a matching pattern. When multiple transducers pick up aligned sine waves, it suggests not merely random coincidence, but a measurable physical coupling. Measured coupling, however, is not the same thing as metaphysical explanation. Engineers reading Bentov can say, here is a system showing resonance. Psychologists can point to the way attention and meaning are constructed by expectation and context. Spiritual practitioners can report profound transformative experiences associated with synchronized breath and heartbeat. All three statements are true in their registers. The core requirement for moving from interesting correlation to robust claim is replication by independent teams and careful controls to rule out artifacts. Bentov reported consistent measurements within his experimental setup. He documented what he saw with the gear he had. He argued for further replication. Independent labs in mainstream neuroscience and psychophysiology have since developed methods to study heart-brain coherence and its correlates in attention and emotion. The HeartMath Institute, for instance, has published work showing that cardiac rhythms relate to measures of coherence and certain cognitive emotional states. Those results suggest a genuine domain of inquiry. Physiological coherence appears to correlate with changes in subjective experience and certain measurable outcomes, like heart rate variability and EEG patterns. How far that correlation stretches toward claims of remote perception or altered time perception remains contested. One way to make the mechanism feel less occult is to lean into mechanics. Picture the spine like a set of tuned rods, and the skull as a casing that can sympathetically vibrate when excited. When the heart contracts, the arterial pulse produces a mechanical wave that moves through the aorta and into the chest cavity. In Bentov's description, the timing and shape of the aortic pressure wave can, under certain breathing and posture configurations, produce a near-sinusoidal mechanical signal transmitted along connective tissue and the spinal column. If the brain's electrical dynamics are predisposed to oscillate at a similar bandwidth, say by producing strong alpha or low theta rhythms, the two can lock into a phase relationship. That phase locking is a form of entrainment. Two oscillating systems adapt to each other and settle into a shared rhythm. In human terms, entrainment of heart and brain may change the dynamics of attention, making certain information more salient and expanding the timescale over which incoming events are integrated. Expanded integration can feel like time stretching and a thickening of the moment, what meditators call presence, and what some experimental subjects describe as access to remote or non-local information. Bentov's instruments recorded signals that, when filtered and displayed, looked striking, waveforms that had been jagged and out of phase, smoothed into steady, nearly sinusoidal traces. Field meters recorded a subtle but repeatable extension of an electromagnetic envelope beyond the immediate boundary of the skull. In interviews and in his writings, he described this as the body's electromagnetic field opening in a way that could be detected by instruments placed a short distance away. He was careful to emphasize scale. These were small, low-frequency changes, not the kind of broadcast power magnetic fields we use in electrical engineering. The field he described was weak, subtle, and easily swamped by noise. That made the reproducibility of his measurements a technical challenge. It also made them intriguing to people who study systems that operate at the margins of detectability. Nothing about this is unassailable. The measurement techniques available in the 1960s and 1970s had limits. Sensor sensitivity, shielding from electromagnetic noise, and proper statistical controls were not always up to the standards we demand today. Some researchers looked at Bentov's work and saw methodological gaps. Others saw the beginning of a line of inquiry that could, with modern tools, be clarified. The prudent scientific stance is to mark the finding as provisional. Bentov measured phenomena that hint at a real coupling between cardiac mechanical signals, brain rhythms, and an external electromagnetic field. The existence of the coupling is the documented part. Interpretations about consciousness extending beyond the skull or about perception of distant events are interpretations that require additional evidence. That caveat aside, it's easy to understand why these ideas captured imaginations beyond the lab. If attention and perception are partially determined by measurable bodily rhythms, then they can, in principle, be trained and modulated. Bentov took that idea seriously. He did not present it as a spiritual cheat code, but as an engine to study. Posture matters because mechanical transmission matters. Breath matters because it shapes cardiac timing. Attention matters because it biases neural oscillators. The experiment, and the practice that followed, was to attempt a controlled, repeatable set of maneuvers that produced a coherent state. This was engineering applied to the mind. The personal side of Bentov's story is important for how the scientific claims were received. He was not an ivory tower theoretician. He was an applied inventor who built things that worked in hospitals. That track record granted him credibility among some peers and a patience among readers who might otherwise dismiss speculative claims. His voice blended anecdote and measurement, which can be a problematic mix for strict empiricists and a persuasive combination for curious practitioners. People who read his work often found the style inviting. He spoke like someone looking for the simplest common thread between clocks, hearts, and cosmic harmonics, and because his writing is accessible, it has become a bridge text, drawing engineers, meditators, and curious lay readers into a conversation that otherwise would remain divided by disciplinary silos. It's at the junction of those silos that the historical drama thickens. Bentov's publications and lectures did not remain footnotes. Decades after his death, declassified government files, the 1983 Gateway Process Memo among them, surfaced and revealed that certain intelligence projects had explored methods to induce hemispheric synchronization and control attention to produce non-ordinary states. Those memos discussed techniques like guided audio, biofeedback, and synchronized brain stimulation to create conditions for what the authors call expanded perception and non-local consciousness. These programs, later folded under names like Project Stargate, produced experiments and internal assessments. Some reports note statistical results that their authors interpreted as above-chance performance in remote viewing tasks. Other documents express caution and methodological concerns. The presence of these files in the public record demonstrates institutional interest in the possibility that altered attention states could be operationalized, at least in controlled settings. A careful narrator must immediately add that institutional interest is not proof that someone weaponized the findings in the dramatic way conspiracy narratives sometimes assert. Declassified memos are not the same as operational deployment records, and even when agencies fund fringe research, they often do so to explore the limits of cognition within a larger portfolio of programs that include much more mundane studies. Nevertheless, when an experimental engineer reports a measurable physiological coherence that could, in theory, be tuned to alter attention, and when intelligence memos later describe procedures that aim at related outcomes, the overlap is more than serendipity. It becomes a line of evidence that calls for careful investigation. Document the measurements, document the memos, and then map the causal chain, if one exists, with rigorous caution. That is where the plane crash enters the story. In 1979, Bentov died in an accident that brought public attention to the pages he was carrying. The official reports cited weather and mechanical failures as primary factors. Many who admired his work mourned the loss and kept talking about the ideas he had left behind. Others noticed how patterns of discovery often seem to precede institutional appropriation. An experimental finding, public curiosity, and then a patchwork of classified projects that echo some of the same language. When the declassified Project Stargate materials came out years later, some readers drew lines back to Bentov as a cultural antecedent, not as proved source material for the memos, but as part of a broader ecology of thought that fed into institutional curiosity. This is an important distinction. The documents do not show an explicit handoff of Bentov's notes into a covert program. What they do show is a broader thematic convergence around synchronization, resonance, and the manipulation of attention. Let me be explicit here. The segment that follows the crash is interpretive territory. The official investigation concluded that mechanical and atmospheric factors caused the accident. That is the documented finding. The pattern some readers see, that the measurement preceded institutional interest and that related techniques later appear in declassified memos, is a plausible narrative, but it remains a hypothesis, not a verdict. That distinction matters because it shapes how we think about power, responsibility, and the ethics of researching consciousness. If physiological coherence can be induced, and if that induction can change perception, institutions may reasonably study it for intelligence, security, or health reasons. Whether those studies were used or misused is a separate question that requires different kinds of evidence. While we sit with that unresolved cluster, it's worth returning to the technical specifics that make the Gateway Memo and Bentov's accounts feel oddly familiar. The Gateway Memo discusses the idea of inducing hemispheric synchronization, getting the left and right halves of the brain to work in a coordinated fashion, often using audio tones, guided visualization, and biofeedback. The engineering principle is straightforward. If two oscillators share a frequency and a stable phase relation, their interactions become predictable and, in some cases, amplifying. In the brain, hemispheric synchronization is associated with states of focused attention and certain meditative experiences. Bentov's account emphasized the mechanical side, the heart and the spine, while the Gateway-style accounts emphasize neural entrainment and audible beats. The overlap is not exact, but the shared language, synchronization, resonance, induced coherence, is a remarkable point of contact. Those memos included protocol outlines that read, at first glance, like a how-to for altered attention. Stabilize breathing. Use patterned audio stimulation to produce a matched brain rhythm. Use biofeedback to reinforce the pattern, and then use guided attention to access particular states. Project Stargate's experiments on remote viewing attempted to quantify whether individuals could report information about distant targets at rates above chance, with mixed results. Some studies reported statistical anomalies that researchers found intriguing. Others complained of small sample sizes and methodological flaws. The declassified documents are candid about both the promise and the limits. They are, in short, a record of institutional exploration, rather than a dossier of triumphant mastery. At this point in the story, we reach a fork that will dominate the rest of our exploration. One branch leads toward possibility and empowerment. The idea that training the nervous system can reduce reactivity, increase empathy, and expand perception in ways that serve individual and collective flourishing. The other branch is the darker concern. That knowledge of perceptual entrainment and attentional control could be weaponized, turned into techniques to nudge or manipulate large populations when combined with modern surveillance and predictive algorithms. The first branch hangs on reproducible, transparent research and careful ethical dissemination. The second branch depends on scaling. How do you move from interesting lab results to tools that can affect millions? Modern infrastructure, big data, targeted advertising, and algorithmic prediction provides a credible vector for that scaling. When you overlay physiological entrainment techniques with systems that know you better than you know yourself, the ethical stakes shift. For now, however, we are still on the ground of laboratory result and historical fact. Bentov's measurements, the 7 Hz resonance, the cardiac spinal cranial mechanical chain, the fields detectable by sensitive meters, are the documented bedrock that allows us to ask bigger questions. The declassified memos are another documented layer that shows institutional curiosity about inducing coherence. What remains to be established with rigor is the causal chain linking the two and the degree to which any of this was harnessed at scale. That is the investigative journey ahead. Before moving forward, a note of practical clarity. The instruments Bentov used were not magic. They were mechanical and electrical sensors with limits. He was observant and persuasive, but his findings sit most comfortably as invitations for modern scientists to replicate with better shielding, more robust statistics and larger samples. They also invite ethical reflection on how we treat technologies that change attention. Because attention is not simply private feeling, it shapes decisions, relationships, and social norms. A practice that widens attention bandwidth can have liberatory effects for individuals, but when combined with technologies designed to predict and modify behavior, it can also become a lever of influence. Recognizing both potentials is part of the balanced view we need. At this juncture in our story, the plot thickens in another direction: the emergence of programs and people who took a systematic interest in perception control as a skill set. Former military and intelligence practitioners later described training techniques designed to push people into altered states and then use those states for interrogation, intelligence gathering, or resilience training. Gregory Hughes, a figure who appears in accounts of controlled perception training, outlined procedures that mixed sensory overload, rhythmic induction, and suggestive framing to change how subjects experienced reality. Those accounts are operational descriptions of method more than moral judgments about use. They illustrate a technical potential. Perception can be guided, attention can be entrained, and the cognitive filter that shapes reality is, to some degree, manipulable. When you connect that potential to Bentov's empirically grounded curiosity, the narrative acquires urgency. An engineer measures a resonance. Intelligence memos outline methods to produce similar states, and operational personnel develop protocols that could be used in contexts as varied as resilience training and interrogation. The combination raises two interrelated questions. First, what exactly did Bentov measure, and how robust are those measurements? Second, if induced coherence is feasible and reproducible, what norms should govern its use in a world of asymmetric power and predictive infrastructures? We will come back to both questions. For now, the trail winds between scientific detail and human drama, between an engineer's bench and a pile of declassified memos. The stakes are not merely theoretical. If the nervous system's bandwidth biases reality, then shifting that bandwidth opens doors to compassion, to clarity, and to experiences that feel liberating. But shifting it without consent or without ethical oversight could also create seams where manipulation passes for persuasion and where subtle control feels indistinguishable from outright coercion. That duality is the moral engine of the story, and it is why Bentov's measured 7 Hz rhythm matters beyond the laboratory. It is a hinge on which both hope and hazard can swing. After Bentov's death, the notebooks he carried became objects of lore. Researchers, practitioners, and later journalists sifted through public archives, piecing together references and echoes. The declassified Gateway memo would later surface as a document describing protocols that overlap conceptually with Bentov's interests. Scholars note the similarity in language, synchronization, resonance, hemispheric coherence, and treat it as circumstantial evidence of an intellectual ecosystem rather than as a direct line of attribution. The pattern is suggestive. Independent lines of inquiry, sometimes separated by discipline and institution, converging on a surprising conclusion that manipulating physiological rhythms might change perception in measurable ways. That convergence is where our narrative must pause and examine method. Science advances through attempted replication, peer review, and careful elimination of confounds. Many of the intriguing findings in consciousness research have struggled at that bar. Studies of remote perception, for example, have produced mixed results across laboratories. Our current consensus, if there is one, is cautious curiosity. There are measurable, reproducible phenomena related to heart-brain coherence and attention. There are also contested or weakly replicated claims about non-local perception. And then there is the socio-technical question of what happens when those physiological techniques get paired with digital systems that can model and nudge behavior at massive scale. We have reached a point in the story where the investigative narrator must make a conscious choice about emphasis. Do we hold the microscope over the instruments, drilling down into signal analysis and statistical critiques? Or do we broaden the lens, exploring the social consequences of treating attention as an engineering problem? The honest answer is, we do both. Understanding the physics of a 7 Hz oscillation requires careful laboratory work. Understanding how that oscillation might be used in society requires tracing funding, policy, and power relationships. Both strands are necessary to assess the title claim honestly. This scientist uncovered the shocking connection between consciousness and reality. The shocking part is not that he reported a frequency. Scientists report frequencies all the time. The shock comes from the way that single measured oscillation opens a highway of possibility, from personal transformation to institutional deployment, from modest lab curiosity to programs seeking to turn attention itself into a controllable parameter. At this moment, with the instruments warmed and the memos declassified, the story is poised between 2 arcs. One arc will follow the instruments deeper: replication attempts, modern psychophysiology studies, HeartMath's coherence metrics, and a careful unpacking of what resonance means when measured with modern gear. The other arc will move outward, tracing the gateway memos into the operations and ethics of intelligence programs, examining how algorithmic prediction and targeted influence could scale perceptual control, and assessing the social consequences of a world where attention is an engineered commodity. Either way, the scene is set. An engineer measured a subtle harmonic that suggests the nervous system can, under certain conditions, alter its bandwidth and thus the texture of perceived reality. Declassified documents show institutional interest in producing similar states at a programmatic level, and a tragic death interrupted a career that, some argue, might have produced more public, replicable data had it continued. These facts establish a provocative through line without collapsing it into conjecture. They demand further investigation into the instruments, the memos, and the ethical frameworks we must build if attention becomes tractable at population scale. If you've stayed this far, you probably want to know what comes next. How robust are those measurements under modern scrutiny? What exactly the gateway documents propose, and whether anyone has responsibly translated physiological entrainment into training that helps people rather than manipulates them. In the next segment, we will follow the lab methods with greater technical specificity, examine the declassified memos in close detail, and begin to map a practical, safety-oriented protocol inspired by Bentov's engineering sensibilities. A protocol that emphasizes gradual pacing, measurable markers, and integration into ordinary life rather than dramatic retreats from it. But before we move there, take a moment to hold the central tension. A single measured rhythm can be a doorway to freedom or to control, depending on how it is used. That is the ethical hinge of the story, and it is precisely why this engineer's notes, his measurements, and his untimely death still matter in the archive of ideas we are trying to understand. If you want to follow the documents and experiments themselves, the original memos, the archived lab notes, and the modern replications, subscribe for future episodes where we will share source documents and walk through them line by line. For now, keep in mind the 2 kinds of evidence that matter: the physical measurements Bentov reported and the institutional interest they seemingly paralleled. Both are documented, both require interpretation. And both lead us toward a practical question. If we can change our perceptual bandwidth, how should we do it responsibly? That question will be the bridge between scientific curiosity and ethical action. And it is the bridge we will begin to cross next. What follows picks up where the instruments and memos left off, moving from intriguing signals on a bench to the messy realities of replication, institutional appetite, practical training, and the ethical question of what to do when a tiny measured rhythm points toward a possible way to shift how large numbers of people experience the world. First, the lab work. Bentov's original toolkit, ballistocardiographic pickups, crude EEG leads, basic field meters, was sufficient to show patterns. What modern investigators need are more sensitive sensors, better shielding, and experimental designs that can separate artifact from effect. Replication starts with the basics. Can independent teams, using contemporary equipment and blinded protocols, find the same spectral signature near 7 Hz when subjects adopt the postures and breathing patterns Bentov described? Some laboratories working on heart-brain coherence, most notably groups focusing on heart rate variability and neurocardiology, have shown reproducible correlations. Certain breathing patterns and focused attention lead to predictable changes in cardiac timing and to shifts in low-frequency EEG power. HeartMath and other psychophysiology centers have published work correlating coherent cardiac rhythms with improved self-reports of emotional regulation and some cognitive markers. Those are measurable, useful results that sit squarely in the documented column. The more contested area is the jump from coherence to non-local perception. Project Stargate's public files describe experiments where trained individuals attempted to describe distant targets under controlled conditions. Some datasets contained apparently above-chance scoring, others were equivocal. Meta-analyses in parapsychology have long argued about effect sizes and replication failure rates. The careful scientific takeaway is simple and sharp. At present, there are robust, replicable phenomena around heart-brain coupling and its effect on attention and emotion, and there are more fragile, contested signals about information seemingly sourced beyond immediate sensory channels. Those fragile signals require larger, pre-registered studies with modern controls before they can be accepted as anything more than intriguing anomalies. This methodological conservatism is not a philosophical refusal to engage with unusual results. It is the technical requirement scientists impose to separate signal from the many ways a human system can deceive itself. Expectation, inadvertent cueing, statistical quirks, and instrumentation artifacts. An honest replication program would pre-register protocols, include sham controls, blind both subjects and raters, and publish null results as readily as positive ones. It would test whether the 7 Hz spectral bump is reproducible across labs, whether the electromagnetic envelope Bentov measured persists under modern shielding, and whether subjective reports of expanded perception track independent physiological markers like heart-brain phase locking. Even with that caveat, it is useful to zoom in on specific measurable markers that a modern practitioner could sensibly track without medicalizing the practice. Heart rate variability, HRV, is one such marker. It indexes the dynamic interplay of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous activity and is sensitive to breathing cadence. EEG bands, particularly low alpha and high theta ranges, offer another window, and simultaneous ECG-EEG recordings can be analyzed for phase relationships. Portable consumer-grade HRV monitors and EEG headbands have limits, but they offer a way to gather preliminary within-person data. Did your coherence metrics change after a month of training? Did you notice consistent subjective differences, less reactivity, different time feel, clearer pattern detection that align with physiological shifts? Those are legitimate starting points for careful, amateur science when framed as exploratory rather than conclusive. Now the memos. The declassified 1983 Gateway Process Memo is an institutional document that explicitly analyzes methods for producing altered states, including audio-driven hemispheric synchronization and biofeedback. It reads like an operational literature review and theoretical proposal more than a finalized toolkit. The memo's language, synchronization, resonance, hemisphere coordination echoes Bentov's vocabulary, but documentation does not equate to provenance. Institutional interest in a scientific idea often springs from its theoretical plausibility and the possibility of operational gain. Intelligence and defense agencies fund exploratory work all the time. The presence of memos shows curiosity and investment, not necessarily mastery or malfeasance. What the files do show repeatedly is a pattern of exploration, followed by cautious, sometimes classified, application. Project Stargate's materials include both procedural outlines and internal evaluations. They contain experiments with training protocols, statistical reports, and a candid mixture of hopeful interpretation and methodological doubt. From the declassified record, one cannot conclude a sweeping operational success. One can conclude that governments investigated whether attention could be trained and whether trained attention could produce useful intelligence signals. The public record stops short of showing a durable, scalable capability. What it does reveal is that institutional actors took the possibility seriously enough to spend resources on it. That institutional seriousness matters because of scale. Individual coherence practices, if effective in creating calmer, more attuned people, are transformational on a personal level. But what happens when similar mechanisms are folded into systems designed for persuasion at scale? Here the analysis must turn to modern data infrastructures. Surveillance capitalism, targeted advertising, and predictive analytics represent tools that can already model and nudge behavior without touching physiology. Combine a scalable model of attention, understanding when someone is susceptible, receptive, or highly reactive, with ubiquitous behavior prediction, and you have the architecture for targeted influence. Several lines of research in behavioral prediction, some funded with public grants and some developed in private labs, show how much data can reveal about moment-to-moment mental states. Scholars like Alex Pentland have documented the ways behavioral signals can predict trends. Companies have leveraged similar insights to craft persuasive interfaces. These are documented patterns of capability, not conspiratorial speculations. They form the infrastructure that would be needed to scale any perceptual entrainment technique into a mechanism for mass influence. There are two distinct vectors for scaling perceptual manipulation. The first is direct physiological entrainment at distance. The idea that large electromagnetic installations or targeted acoustic environments could push people's nervous systems into specific rhythms en masse. The physics of that claim is difficult. The low-frequency fields Bentov and others measured are weak, and effective large-scale entrainment would face enormous engineering and biological noise challenges. The second vector is subtler and more plausible: behavioral and informational entrainment, algorithms that know who you are, your sleep schedule, affective triggers, social network vulnerabilities, can time messages and curate content to increase suggestibility. When content arrives aligned with a person's physiological state, say, when they are already in a low vigilance window, persuasive outcomes become easier. That is the real present risk. Not an electromagnetic broadcast rewriting minds, but an ecological engineering of attention through data-driven content that leverages times when people are physiologically and psychologically more malleable. Historical actors who experimented with perception control were often practical in orientation. Accounts of controlled perception training describe sequences that mix sensory overload, rhythmic induction, and suggestion to alter attentional sets. Gregory Hughes and other former practitioners have described methods where disrupt and reframe tactics reduce stable attentional filters, followed by structured suggestion to seed alternative patterns. Those operational descriptions are technical, not moral judgments. They illustrate the capabilities of trained systems to change how people process reality. When placed beside modern content delivery architectures, they create a plausible pathway from individual entrainment to engineered influence. If the path from laboratory finding to societal application worries you, the practical question becomes, what can individuals and communities do to armor themselves while preserving the liberatory potential of cultivating coherence? The practical protocol we present next is designed around that duality. It treats physiology as an instrument that can be trained for better emotional regulation, clarity, and presence. And it insists on gradual pacing, measurement, and integration into ordinary life to minimize risk. Safety preface: this protocol is educational, not medical. If you have a history of psychiatric illness, epilepsy, dissociative disorders, or are taking medications that affect heart rhythm, consult a healthcare professional before beginning intentional physiological training. If practicing the techniques produces overwhelming dissociation, hallucinations, persistent anxiety, or any change that impairs daily functioning, stop and seek professional help. On-screen disclaimer to display with the protocol, not medical advice. If you have a psychiatric condition, consult a healthcare professional before practicing. Follow this rule strictly. The practice is a physiology-first, incremental protocol inspired by Bentoff's descriptions and by contemporary coherence work. It emphasizes posture, timed breathing, heart focus, and short daily sessions with objective markers. It is intentionally conservative: short sessions, slow progress, and integration into daily routines. Phase 0, preparation, week 0. Duration, several days of planning, no formal induction work. Goals, establish baseline, minimize confounds, set safety anchors. What to do? Pick a consistent time and place for practice, preferably a quiet spot where interruptions are unlikely. Establish a simple journal or log where you will note session length, subjective state before and after, and any unusual sensations. If possible, obtain a simple HRV monitor or a smartwatch with heart rate recording, optional. These devices are not diagnostic but can provide within-person comparative data. Notice, identify grounding practices to use if you feel overwhelmed. Standing and walking barefoot for a few minutes, drinking water, calling a trusted friend, or performing gentle physical movement. Remember, this is small-scale training to improve attention and regulation, not a gateway to guaranteed extraordinary perceptions. Phase 1. Foundational coherence, weeks 1-2. Daily session, 10 minutes, once per day. Main elements: posture. Sit on a chair with feet flat on the floor, spine erect but relaxed. Imagine a gentle lengthening from the base of the spine toward the crown. Shoulders soft. Breath. Box breathing at a conservative cadence. Inhale 4 counts, hold 4 counts, exhale 4 counts, hold 4 counts. If 4 seconds per phase is uncomfortable, shorten to 3.3.3.3. The goal is even, rhythmic breathing that stabilizes heart timing. Heart focus. After 2 minutes of box breathing, shift attention to the area around the heart. Not a visualization of love or energy. Simply feel the mechanical beat. Notice the timing of each contraction. If helpful, place a hand lightly over the chest to amplify proprioceptive feedback. Gentle wave. With attention on the heart, imagine the mechanical pulse traveling up the spine to the base of the skull. Keep this image soft and descriptive rather than commanding. The image is a tuning suggestion. Close. Return attention to breath for 2 cycles. Place both hands on knees and open eyes slowly. Markers: subjective sense of calm, slight slowing of breath, mild increase in interoceptive clarity. Optional: record HRV before and after to track short-term changes. Phase 2, coherence deepening, weeks 3-6. Daily session, 10-20 minutes, once per day. Main elements: warm-up, 2 to 3 minutes of basic breath awareness. Extended box breathing. Transition to 4 to 6 counts per phase as tolerated, e.g. 5.55 on 5, keeping comfort and non-strain paramount. Heart-brain phase feel. After the breath stabilizes, attend to the timing relationship between your heartbeat and a felt internal rhythm. Imagine a slow, steady meter at roughly 6 to 8 beats per second. This is metaphorical. Do not force the heart. The intent is to allow discovered resonance rather than to manufacture it. Micro-movement, gentle chin tuck to align cervical spine for a few breaths, then return to upright. Bentoff emphasized mechanical transmission. Small adjustments can change proprioceptive feedback. Biofeedback, optional. If you have an HRV device that can display coherence in near real time, use it sparingly to learn what feeling aligns with better coherence. Then wean off the screen. The goal is embodied skill, not device dependence. Markers: clearer periods of focused attention during the day, reduced reactive responses in small stressors, subjective report of time thickening in sessions. If any practice produces persistent derealization, stop and consult a professional. Phase 3. Attentional extension and integration, weeks 7 to 12. Daily session, 15 to 30 minutes, 4-6 times per week. Main elements: longer coherence practice, combine breathing, heart focus, and a soft sensory anchor. A low-volume steady tone or tactile metronome can help. Hemispheric balancing exercises, simple alternating nostril breathing or non-strenuous cross-lateral movement, right hand to left knee, performed slowly to encourage bilateral coordination. These are low-risk, widely used practices included as attentional warm-ups rather than mystical tools. Contextual application, practice maintaining calm attention during brief real-world triggers, busy coffee lines, difficult messages, short meetings. Use a 2-breath reset before responding in conversations. Social entrainment experiment, optional. With consent, practice the coherence routine with a trusted partner for 5 minutes and note whether mutual reactivity reduces. Markers: consistent perceived reductions in reactivity, small improvements in interpersonal tone, better sleep for some practitioners. Keep journaling. Maintenance and escalation, beyond week 12. If progress is steady, sessions can remain at 20-30 minutes, with occasional longer sittings on weekends. Resist the urge to isolate or to pursue escalated practices without careful support. Dramatic increases in session length or intensity raise the probability of destabilization. Expected subjective outcomes and measurable correlates. What participants often report in controlled, gradual programs is less reactivity, meaning you notice anger or panic earlier and can step back, greater clarity for short periods, an enhanced sense of being present, and sometimes unusual temporal effects during sessions, minutes feeling elongated or compressed. HeartMath-style studies show these subjective shifts can correlate with increased HRV coherence and modest changes in EEG low-frequency bands. Importantly, these gains are individual and variable. Some people find immediate benefit in stress-prone contexts. Others experience only subtle shifts. None of these reported outcomes are guaranteed. Warnings about overload and spiritual bypassing. A small but important minority of people report challenging reactions when they accelerate practice too quickly. Derealization, transient dissociation, disruptive sleep patterns, or experiences that feel psychotic-like. These are rare but real. Part of responsible practice is social integration. Keep your job, continue relationships, and use grounding practices if sensations of unreality appear. If a practice destabilizes your functioning, stop and seek clinical consultation. Do not interpret destabilizing experiences as proof of being on the verge of a breakthrough. Treat them as signs to slow down and integrate. Beyond the individual, social entrainment and collective effects. If you've practiced in pairs, you may have noticed something simple. When two calm people enter a charged room, the room's tone shifts. That is social entrainment in microcosm. Small, coherent fields influencing local affective environments. Bentoff's claim, and the broader speculative arc, is that if coherence spreads widely enough, it can shift local baselines of attention. The tuning fork metaphor is instructive. A single fork will not retune a room. Many forks struck together produce a perceptible field. Applied ethically, this suggests grassroots resilience. Communities practicing basic coherence could create pockets of reduced reactivity that make persuasion campaigns less effective locally. Applied maliciously, the same dynamics suggest targeted interventions aimed at creating or amplifying collective emotional states could be potent. This is where ethics and civic design become practical concerns. If democratic societies value attention as a public good, shared conditions that support deliberation and autonomy, then protecting attentional niches from exploitative design becomes as important as protecting privacy. That protection can take many forms: transparency in algorithmic curation, public education about attention mechanics, and accessible programs teaching basic coherence tools for emotional regulation without extraordinary claim. These are civic technologies of resilience, not technical silver bullets. Returning to the historical trail, the crash, the notebooks, and the editorial note. We must revisit the 1979 plane crash because it remains a hinge in the narrative of pattern and possibility. The documented official finding attributes the accident to mechanical and weather factors. That is the record. Equally documented is the fact that Bentov carried significant notes and diagrams, and that in subsequent decades, certain intelligence memos surfaced describing comparable techniques. The connection between those two facts is an arguable pattern, not a concluded proof. This segment is speculative. Consider including both the official investigation conclusion and the pattern-based question. The ethical stance here is investigative humility. Present both the established facts and the questions they raise, but avoid substituting intrigue for evidentiary rigor. What would rigorous follow-up look like? If one wanted to convert curiosity into conclusive knowledge, a coordinated research program would include pre-registered replication attempts of Bentov-style protocols, multi-site studies linking subjective reports to concurrent HRV and EEG markers, and double-blind remote perception tests with modern statistical power. Parallel to that, social scientists should model how informational ecosystems amplify or dampen effects of individual coherence practices at scale. Ethics boards, funding agencies, and community stakeholders would need to collaborate. Research that touches attention and perception has social consequences and must be governed transparently. A pragmatic roadmap for community-level resilience includes 3 levers. 1. Personal practice taught conservatively and broadly, accessible, low-barrier coherence training that emphasizes safety and integration. 2. Public education about attention, simple literacy campaigns about how timing, content, and physiological states shape receptivity. 3. Policy and platform accountability, algorithms and interfaces designed with a public interest baseline rather than purely engagement-maximizing motives. Case examples, small-scale reports and concrete effects. Across anecdotal reports and small studies, people who engage in regular coherence training commonly mention 4 practical effects. First, reduced reactivity. A practice pause becomes a habit, allowing for considered responses in tense moments. Second, improved focus. Shorter tasks can be completed with less mental chatter. Third, emotional clarity. Some people report they can hold difficult emotions without impulsive action. Fourth, social attunement. In group settings, calmer individuals often downgrade conflict intensity and model different conversational rhythms. These are modest but meaningful outcomes that do not require metaphysical interpretation to be valuable. Detecting manipulation in the wild. If systems exist that attempt to influence attention, how does an individual spot them? Look for these red flags: emotionally charged content timed to moments of vulnerability, late-night feeds during national crises, excessive repetition of sensory patterns designed to lower vigilance, hypnotic loops, slow tempos matched to low arousal states, and algorithmic narrowing that surfaces a small subset of emotionally potent signals while suppressing dissenting or context-providing content. Defensive habits are simple. Slow your reply. Check the source. Step away for 5 minutes of grounding breath and ask whether the message asks for urgent action without allowing time for deliberation. These practices are low-tech but effective first lines of defense. The moral hinge: empowerment without isolation. The last long arc of this story returns to the title claim. This scientist uncovered the shocking connection between consciousness and reality. The shock is twofold. First, there is the empirical shock, a measured, reproducible coupling between cardiac spinal mechanical dynamics and brain rhythms that suggests physiology can alter attention. Second, there is the social shock. If attention is an engineerable parameter, then the norms of persuasion, governance, and personal autonomy require urgent rethinking. Both shocks demand responses rooted in civic prudence, scientific rigor, and compassion. Bentoff's legacy, if we accept the generous reading, is not only his waveform traces, but his posture toward inquiry. Engineers' curiosity married to a deep humility about what instruments can tell us. That posture is the right one to take into a world where technology scales influence faster than our cultural and legal frameworks can adapt. Treat the body as an instrument that can be tuned to reduce reactivity and increase clarity, but practice in community, with care and with openness to peer review. To close the loop practically, if you want to explore these ideas responsibly, begin with the conservative protocol above. Keep sessions short, track simple markers, and integrate practice into ordinary life. Share experiences within trusted groups, not as evidence of extraordinary ability, but as data points about how attention and mood respond to regular training. If you are a researcher, consider designing pre-registered replication studies that bridge physiology and perception under rigorous controls. If you are a policymaker or platform designer, think about attention as a public good that platforms can help protect rather than exploit. A final note about the unresolved drama. The crash and the missing notebooks are a magnetic element in this story because they transform a laboratory curiosity into a narrative about power. That magnetism compels us to ask uncomfortable questions about who gets to study the mind, how findings get used, and what counts as public knowledge. The declassified memos and the notebooks both belong in the archive of public inquiry. They should be read, tested and debated, not simply sensationalized or used as proof text for sweeping claims. Now, a concrete invitation. I want to know how this resonates with you. Does the sequence, engineer measures a resonance, notes disappear, institutional memos surface, feel like not an accident or tragic timing? Tell me in the comments which side you lean toward and why. If you want the primary documents and a guided packet to try the conservative protocol safely, join the newsletter listed in the description. We'll share source documents, suggested measurement tools, and a moderated forum for reporting observations. If you decide to try the practice, keep it gentle, keep a journal, and treat any strange experiences as a prompt to slow down and seek support. This is not the end of the question. It is a place to pause and choose. Will we turn a measured curiosity into an effort for personal resilience and public education? Or will we let it be absorbed unexamined into systems that monetize attention? Bentoff's measurements, real and documented, opened a door. How we step through it will define whether that opening becomes a doorway to collective clarity or to greater control. The choice is ours to make, together.